When my brother looked me dead in the eye on Christmas Eve and said, "This dinner is only for people who actually achieved something this year. There's no place for losers here." The entire room went dead silent. My mother pretended to fix the gravy, and my sister-in-law smirked into her wine glass. They all thought I was going to burst into tears, pack my bags, and leave. Instead, I just smiled, politely set down my fork, and nodded. I didn't say a single word. They thought they had successfully humiliated the quiet sibling and erased me from the family legacy. What my brother didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have guessed, was that his cruel little speech had just cost him absolutely everything. The very next morning, I quietly made a single phone call to return a specific gift. Weeks later, a lawyer called him. And now, he's completely going crazy. My name is Jennifer, and I am 30 years old. For as long as I can remember, my family looked at me as the designated underachiever, a quiet freelance designer who barely made enough to get by. At least, that is exactly what I let them believe. My older brother, Julian, was the golden child, a loud, arrogant corporate consultant who wore his success like a weapon and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how much more he made than me. The toxic dynamic peaked on Christmas Eve, a night where the holiday cheer in the air felt entirely suffocating. We were all gathered around the lavishly set dining table at Julian's house. I had spent months quietly preparing a massive surprise for him, a signed legal agreement that would save his struggling business. But Julian didn't know that. He only saw an easy target. In the middle of the main course, he cleared his throat, raised his glass, and looked directly at me with absolute contempt. "This dinner is only for people who actually achieved something this year," Julian announced loudly, his voice echoing through the room. "There's no place for losers here, Jennifer. Maybe you should take your freelance gig and eat in the kitchen." The entire room went dead silent. My mother suddenly became very interested in fixing the gravy boat, and my sister-in-law smirked directly into her wine glass. No one defended me. Julian smiled, completely convinced he had crushed my spirit and solidified his dominance. They all expected me to burst into tears and run out into the snow. Instead, I just stared back at him, felt the absolute coldness settle in my chest, and made a silent vow to change everything. I maintained absolute composure, politely set down my fork, and stood up from the table without saying a single word. Julian's smug smile widened, assuming my silence was proof of my utter defeat. I walked out of his house into the freezing night air, driving back to my apartment with a sharp, burning clarity replacing the hurt. As soon as I got home, I threw my coat aside, and I walked straight to my desk. I pulled open the drawer and took out the manila folder containing the gift I had spent months arranging for him. It wasn't a watch or a designer suit. It was a fully executed, highly lucrative commercial lease transfer. Our late grandfather had left me full control over the downtown office building Julian's firm rented. Knowing his business was secretly suffocating under massive debts, I had signed a legal waiver to grant him the property completely rent-free for the next 10 years, a gift worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I looked down at my signature on the document, remembering how he had just called me a loser in front of the entire family. I smiled grimly, grabbed my phone, and called my corporate real estate coordinator directly at home. "Cancel the transfer," I told him calmly. "Revoke the waiver immediately, readjust the lease to maximum market value, and prepare a formal demand for all back rent." By the time I hung up, I had closed my wallet for good. Julian wanted to pretend I was nothing. Now he was going to find out exactly what happens when a loser stops carrying your weight. 3 weeks passed in absolute deafening silence. I completely cut off contact, ignoring the barrage of condescending text messages from my mother and sister-in-law telling me to stop being dramatic and to just apologize to Julian for ruining the holiday mood. I didn't reply to a single one. I simply went back to my design work, watched the winter snow melt from my apartment window, and let the gears of my legal retaliation turn quietly in the background. Meanwhile, unaware of the trap he had sprung on himself, Julian was busy projecting his usual illusion of grand success. Through social media, I saw photos of him and his wife celebrating the new year, posing in front of their brand new luxury SUVs and hosting expensive dinners. But I knew the truth. Julian's entire lifestyle was a house of cards built on borrowed time and extreme overreach. He was drowning in corporate debt, and his consulting firm was rapidly bleeding cash. He was entirely banking on that Christmas gift to bail him out. He thought he could publicly humiliate me, kick me away like an inconvenience, and still quietly inherit the massive commercial lease break that would wipe his company's overhead down to zero. He had no idea that my property coordinator had already processed the revocation. The financial foundation Julian thought he was securing had completely vanished beneath his feet. Every single day brought him closer to the edge, and the arrogant smile he wore at Christmas was about to be permanently wiped off his face. The storm finally broke on a Tuesday morning when Julian's corporate lawyer called him in a state of absolute, unbridled panic. Julian had been sitting in his corner office, confidently preparing for a routine quarterly financial review, completely expecting the rent-free lease transition to be finalized. Instead, his attorney's voice was shaking over the speakerphone. The legal reality was a brutal awakening. I wasn't the struggling, broke freelancer they all looked down on. The shocking truth was that our late grandfather had bypassed Julian entirely, naming me as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary of the family's commercial property trust. Julian's failing consulting firm operated out of the prime downtown office building that my trust owned. By quietly returning the gift and revoking the rent waiver, I had pulled the entire legal and financial rug out from under his life. The attorney dropped the ultimate bombshell. Not only was the 10-year rent-free extension completely canceled, but the trust was now legally demanding full, immediate payment of all outstanding market-rate back rent and structural fees within 30 days. Julian's jaw dropped as the numbers sank in. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars, and without my signature to bail him out, his business was completely insolvent. The massive house, the luxury cars, and the expensive designer suits were all tied directly to the corporate credit of a company that was now on the verge of total liquidation. The arrogant golden child who had proudly claimed there was no place for losers at his table suddenly realized that his entire survival was at the absolute mercy of the sister he had so casually discarded. Less than 2 hours after his lawyer delivered the news, the front door of my apartment building practically rattled off its hinges. Julian burst through my doorway completely unhinged, his face red and his expensive tie thrown carelessly over his shoulder. The arrogant, composed golden child from Christmas Eve was entirely gone. In his place stood a desperate man losing his mind. He marched right up to my living room table, slammed his fists down, and began screaming. "What kind of sick game are you playing, Jennifer?" he roared, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You canceled the lease transfer. You're demanding back rent? My lawyer says my company faces immediate eviction and liquidation if you don't sign the waiver right now. You are going to ruin my life." I didn't flinch. I slowly set down my coffee mug, leaned back in my chair, and looked up at him with the exact same calm smile I'd worn at his dinner table. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and he could feel it. "I'm confused, Julian," I said, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly level. "Why are you coming to me for help? Just a few weeks ago, you looked me dead in the eye and told the entire family that your home was no place for losers. You told me my freelance business was a joke, and that I belonged in the kitchen." Julian blinked, his frantic anger suddenly morphing into sheer terror as his own cruel words echoed back to him. He stammered, trying to find an excuse, but I stood up and cut him off. Since I'm just a loser with an irrelevant little gig, you shouldn't need a single cent of my charity. Keep your high achievements, Julian, and get out of my apartment. The fallout was immediate and absolutely devastating. Within days, my mother and sister-in-law went from sending condescending texts to practically begging me for mercy on the phone, crying about family loyalty and how we needed to protect Julian's reputation. I blocked their numbers without hesitation. They had sat in comfortable silence while Julian tried to destroy my dignity, so they could sit in silence now while he faced the consequences of his arrogance. Julian's firm could not survive the sudden financial hit. Without the rent waiver, his creditors panicked, his corporate lines of credit were frozen, and within 2 months, his consulting business plummeted into forced liquidation. The luxury SUVs were repossessed, the grand house was put on the market for a forced short sale, and his perfect, expensively maintained lifestyle completely collapsed. I watched it all unfold from a distance, feeling a profound sense of peace. I didn't use the trust's money to be cruel. I used it to quietly expand my own independent design studio, hiring talented creators who had actually been overlooked by arrogant people like my brother. Julian had to learn the hardest lesson of his life. When you treat the people who carry you like losers, you shouldn't be surprised when they finally step aside and let you fall. No one has the right to define your worth or treat your hard work like a failure just to feed their own fragile ego. I took a stand, and it changed my life forever. Now, I want to hear from all of you watching. What would you have done if you were in my shoes at that Christmas dinner? Would you have returned the gift, or would you have handled it differently? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Jennifer's story has reached. Meanwhile, don't leave just yet. I am leaving 2 other incredible dramatic stories right here on the final screen that are absolute channel favorites, and they will completely surprise you. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I will see you in the next story.